Welcome back to another exciting edition of the Philosophical Inquiry Show, where today we're talking about one of my favorite philosophers. Straight out of the 13th century, we're going to be looking at the thought of St. Thomas Aquinas. In the 1870s, a pope by the name of Leo XIII, wrote an important document saying that if you study at a Catholic university, you should take a philosophy class. That should be required, he said, at Catholic universities. And in that philosophy class, you should learn some of the thought of Thomas Aquinas. He kind of put this out there. I don't want to call it the official philosophy of the Catholic Church. That would not be accurate. There is no philosophical argument that Catholics are required to admit the soundness of. So it would be wrong to say that Aquinas is the official philosopher of the Catholic Church. But he's often been considered the kind of gold standard, if you will, the sort of philosopher par excellence in the Catholic tradition. So I'm excited to be here today and to talk to you a little bit about the thought of Thomas Aquinas. He lived from 1225 to 1275 approximately. It's said that he was just not even 50 years old when he died, so he did not live that long. Nevertheless, he wrote a tremendous amount of philosophy and theology. He wrote we have at least 8 million words that Aquinas wrote, 8 million words that we're sure are from Aquinas. We have another 3 million words worth of philosophy and theology that might be from Aquinas, but there's some debate about it. So if you do the math, if this guy started writing philosophy and theology when he was, say, 18, he would have been averaging about 1,000 words a day. So he's a bit of a workaholic, Thomas Aquinas. He's really, really obsessed with this stuff. One story about Aquinas that I think will help you appreciate what we're about to talk about, a story from when he was, maybe 12, 14 years old, thereabouts. His parents had sent him to a Benedictine school where he had a teacher named Big Al, Albertus Magnus, actually. It's usually translated Albert the Great. We could call him Big Al. That would also be a good translation of the Latin, Albertus Magnus, Big Al. Well, we have a story about the young Aquinas in a classroom learning religion. He was in a religion class with Albert the Great. Maybe some of you took religion classes in high school, if you went to a Christian school. Well, it was a religion class like any other. Albert's going on about God this and God that, and that's when the impudent young boy, Aquinas, who was said to have been very quiet, he didn't speak up very often. In fact, others in the class thought he might not have been very smart at all, given how little he had to say about these religious topics that Albert was lecturing on. But Albert's up there going on about God this and God that, and suddenly the teenage boy Aquinas slams his fist down and says, "Enough! You keep using that word, God, but you have not told us what it means." Pretty cool, huh? Did you ever think of doing that? Did you ever think of asking your religion teacher, "Can you define your terms, please? Could you tell us what you mean by that word, God?" Well, that's what Aquinas did. And if you want to understand Aquinas on philosophy and theology, you have to keep in mind something. At no point in his 50 years of life did Aquinas ever, for so much as a moment, pretend to have answered that question. At no point did Aquinas say, now I think I know what God is. Never happened. In fact, over and over, Aquinas writes in his writings. I've found at least 11 instances of Aquinas writing. We can know that God exists, but not what God is. So we're going to be talking about what that's all about here today. Aquinas, like I said, he's a workaholic. We now know that he had secretaries. He had terrible handwriting, absolutely awful, awful handwriting. I can't really bring up a sample of it here, but it's completely illegible. Completely. Google it for yourself if you don't believe me. And so, his religious superiors, Aquinas belonged to a religious order known as the Dominicans. also known as the Order of Preachers. It's like the Jesuits, but not Jesuits, Dominicans. They were about 100 years old at the time. They were a religious order of beggars. They did not live in monasteries and support themselves like Benedictines did. They were traveling itinerant. They were like hippies. They were beggars. And Aquinas, because his handwriting was so bad, but his religious superiors in the Dominican order realized, oh, this guy's writing some important stuff. They assigned him secretaries. And so Aquinas would wake up in the morning, he would go to the chapel and pray alone, he would say Mass, then he would get to work, and he would start dictating to one of his secretaries some work of philosophy or theology. And as his secretary wrote down everything he said, eventually Aquinas would need a quote. And so he would say, oh, go consult Book 4 of Aristotle's Metaphysics and write down the quote from there. That's in section 8. Aquinas had this photographic memory. He memorized all these. He memorized the whole Bible. Then, while the secretary was off fetching that quote to insert in the work, Aquinas would turn to secretary number 2 and start lecturing on another topic of philosophy and theology. So he would have 2 books going at any given time. And it's also believed that he had a third secretary who sat next to his bed while he slept, because Aquinas would just get up in the middle of the night and start talking about philosophy and theology. So his third secretary would sit by his bed, and when Aquinas would leap up and start talking about philosophy, that scribe would write down what he said. Aquinas' most famous work is called the Summa Theologiae, Summa-Theologiae. 60 volumes. If you come to my office, you can see all 60 volumes of it. He didn't finish it. He never finished it. And what I'm going to be talking to you about today is all stuff that Aquinas discusses in like the first 20 pages of this immensely huge work called the Summa Theologiae. So I tell you this because I want you to keep in mind that what you're getting is just the simplest, most beginning part of the story. You know, imagine, getting a 2-page summary of The Lord of the Rings, right? That 3-volume long masterpiece of fantasy by J.R.R. Tolkien. It has dozens upon dozens of characters and settings and maps and details and layer upon layer of symbolism and meaning. Well, imagine if I just gave you a couple pages that summarize, just the first book of The Lord of the Rings. Well, that's about what we're going to do with the Summa Theologiae today. I'm going to give you a very brief overview of some stuff that Aquinas does in the first 20 pages of the Summa Theologiae. I'm afraid I cannot give you the whole story in one half-hour lecture. If you take a class with me like Faith and Reason, we might go a little bit further into the Summa Theologiae, but always remember, there's more to be discovered in the thought of Thomas Aquinas. Well, to talk about Aquinas on God, which is what I want to talk about today, this is where Aquinas' thought is usually discussed, his so-called philosophy of religion, his philosophical theology. I want to discuss that in 3 parts. First, notions of God, or ways of thinking philosophically about God. There's other ways of thinking about God. If you go to church, you're going to think about God in a very pious way on your knees. You can read the Bible and think about God as you can read the 23rd Psalm. You can think about God as your good shepherd who's going to get you through these difficult times. But what if we want to think about God philosophically? What are some strategies for that? Well, Aquinas asks this question. Can the existence of God be demonstrated? Or are there any proofs for the existence of God? Now, Aquinas will famously go on to offer the so-called famous 5 ways. 5 ways. Aquinas will offer 5 arguments for the existence of God. Five arguments, 5 little paragraphs, each one of which concludes, therefore, this exists and we call it God. But when Aquinas asks the question, can God's existence be proved? He doesn't offer the arguments that God exists. Isn't that interesting? Can the existence of God be proved? Well, the most immediate way of answering that question, I would think, if you think the answer is yes, as Aquinas will say it is, you would think the most immediate answer would be, well, yes, let me show you how. Here's 5 ways. And yet, that's not what Aquinas does. He says, yes, the existence of God can be proved. But first, he says, let's consider some objections to that claim. Aquinas is obsessed. I mean, if you want to learn good philosophy, one thing you can learn from Aquinas is how obsessively and meticulously he considers strong objections to his own position. I'll say this again. Every position that Aquinas stakes out in the Summa Theologiae, he will offer a series of strong, very strong. You almost get the sense Aquinas must have been going out there and asking people, very smart people, his colleagues who disagreed with him, find the best reasons to think I'm wrong, because he always considers strong objections. So, what's an objection that Aquinas considers to the claim that he's going to make that the existence of God can be demonstrated? Well, one objection, I think it's a very important objection, goes like this. If you want to prove that something exists, you have to know what you're talking about. If you want to go find out if leprechauns exist, if you want to do an investigation and see if there are any leprechauns, well, you had better damn well know that a leprechaun is a little Irishman who hoards gold on the other side of the rainbow. Okay? And if you bring to me Mr. Whiskers and she's going meow, 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 purr, 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 and say, look, leprechauns, I'm going to say, I'm sorry, you've proved nothing, idiot. Well, Aquinas is thinking that something like that might happen when we question the existence of God. Remember, Aquinas is committed to the view that he does not know what God is. In fact, that's another objection that he considers is that whatever God is, if it's the God worshipped by Christians and Jews, and nowadays we would also add Muslims, whatever God is, it has to be infinitely greater than anything we can comprehend. So how could you know what God is? How could you prove something infinite from the finite stuff that makes up our world, the mundane stuff? So Aquinas says that if we're going to do philosophy of God, we need some notion to start from, some notions to talk about God, given that we don't know what God is, right? If I told you, for your final paper, I want you to write 1,000 words on whether or not Quattlepuck exists. You should hope I don't assign that for your final paper, because none of you can do it, because none of you know what Quattlepuck is. Well, Aquinas says, how are we going to talk about God, given that we don't know what God is? And Aquinas' answer to this is, we can think of God as creator. That doesn't tell us what God is, by the way. That doesn't tell us God's essence. It doesn't tell us what divinity is, right? Knowing that God is creator, that God is what everything depends on. But is there a creator? That's going to be the question. So Aquinas' answer to the question, can we prove God exists, is not to immediately offer proofs. It's rather to offer some foundational notions for thinking about the inquiry. And I'll give you this foundational notion now. Here it is. If you can prove that the universe that we inhabit is an effect, and it stands as an effect, as effects stand to causes, well, then we'll know God exists. If we can show that the universe is an effect of a cause, then we will know that God exists. Let me put this in a more precise way that I've used before in philosophy of religion. You might say that for Aquinas, the statement God exists means this: there are features of the universe which ought to be causally accounted for, but which cannot be causally accounted for by any other features of the universe. I'll say it again. For Aquinas, the statement God exists means there are features of the universe which ought to be causally accounted for, but which absolutely cannot be causally accounted for by any other feature of the universe. You want me to break it down? I'll break it down. Okay, what's an example of a feature of the universe? Well, I'm recording some lectures right now. That's a feature of the universe. Kovacs is recording lectures on Saturday, October 30th. Now, does that feature of the universe need to be explained? Should it be explained? Yeah! Trust me, there's any number of other things I could have been doing today. I could have stayed home and watched Community. And instead, I'm here recording lectures on Aquinas. And even though I love Aquinas, it's not a necessary feature of the universe. Something brings it about. So how do we explain this feature of the universe? We account for it in terms of other features of the universe, like Kovacs has the job of teaching philosophy. There. I've started with one feature of the universe. Kovacs is lecturing on Aquinas on Saturday morning, and I've causally accounted for it in terms of another feature of the universe. Namely, I'm a philosophy teacher. This is what I get paid to do. That feature of the universe can also be causally accounted for in terms of other features of the universe, right? It's what LMU pays me to do. LMU pays me to do it so that they can continue to have a functioning university. Why is there a functioning, that's a feature of the universe. LMU is a functioning university. Well, it's because we have a country that needs education. We have a lot of donors who have appreciated what LMU has given to our society and our economy and to their lives. Okay. Hey, can I draw your attention to one cool fact about what I just did, that little example I just drew for you? Notice I never changed time tenses. I was always speaking in the present tense, and that's what Aquinas is going to do when he proves the existence of God. We're not talking about history, right? Why is Kovacs in University Hall lecturing on Aquinas? I could have given you some history. Well, I woke up this morning, and that's what I decided I had to do today. And that's because I went to bed last night and didn't get this done before leaving for the weekend. And that's because I kind of, goofed off at work too much on Thursday and Friday. And that's because Wednesday I didn't get enough. Okay, I could do that. We could go back in time, but we're not gonna. Keep that in mind with Aquinas. We're not going back in time. Because Aquinas writes this at one point. It is reasonable, he says, to believe that the universe has always existed. Now, he happens to think that this is contradicted by the Bible. Aquinas happens to think that the first verse of the Bible, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Aquinas happens to think that that verse precludes the possibility of an infinitely temporal universe, of a universe that for any day in the past, there was a day before that. But Aquinas says there's nothing incoherent or illogical about believing the universe has always existed. For example, the way it would be incoherent to believe a triangle has only two sides. Aquinas thinks even if the universe has always existed forever and ever and ever and ever, no matter how far back you go, he thinks he can still prove the existence of God because he's still just looking for features of the universe which ought to be causally accounted for, but which cannot be causally accounted for by any other feature of the universe, right? We causally accounted for me being here, teaching about Aquinas on Saturday morning, in terms, where did we get eventually? Eventually we got to, we have an economy that depends on, or we have donors who believe that the Jesuit education at LMU is good for the economy. That's why I'm here today. I didn't have to go back in time. That's true right now. Well, Aquinas is going to be doing an investigation like that. Are there features of the universe which ought to be causally accounted for, but which cannot be causally accounted for by any other features of the universe? So, having taken up that question, can it be proved that God exists? Aquinas moves on to the next question. Does God exist? And here is where he presents the famous 5 ways. I'm going to talk about the first way for a few minutes. I'll then tell you about all of the rest of the 5 ways. But I think the first way is a good way to really focus our attention on in Intro to Philosophy. The first way is the argument from change. The Latin word is motus, but it should not be translated motion. It should be translated change. Change is a feature of the universe. Aquinas he realizes that ever since Heraclitus, we have realized that from the moment we're born, our senses are just constantly assaulted by change. Well, when you see something changing, Aquinas argues, and he argues this in some detail, some surprising detail. I won't go into it because I think it's almost obvious. But if you see something undergoing change, Aquinas says, you're completely in the right to ask, what's causing that change? If you see a leaf changing color on a tree, right, we should ask, why is that happening? And we do some biology. We learn about science and biochemistry and chlorophyll and all that. And we learn, something's producing change. Aquinas thinks that any time you have something undergoing change, there's something producing the change. Now, is what's producing the change itself undergoing change? That's the question. And Aquinas realizes that our physical universe is constantly undergoing change. The material world is just a world saturated in flux and change. So, if I can ask why a leaf on a tree is changing, if I can ask why the temperature is changing, if I can ask why water is boiling, why milk is going bad, if I can look for the answers to those questions, well, why change at all? Why any change? Why change? This is the first of the 5 ways. You'll notice that it's really just arguing that a particular kind of question is reasonable. The question, why change at all? Not this or that change, but change in general. What is the condition that makes change possible? And, says Aquinas, the answer is, we don't know. We cannot in this life answer the question, why change? Why not? Because anything we can find in this universe, any feature of the universe that might serve as an answer, will itself be something undergoing change. And if it is itself something undergoing change, then it's something we're asking about. It's part of the question. It's part of what we're asking about when we ask why change at all. We're asking about all the things undergoing change, the whole universe of change. How come? We don't know the answer, but, says Aquinas, we do know that whatever the answer is, it's not undergoing change. It's unchangeable. It's unchanged. It's unchanging. I mean, it changes other things. It's changing in the sense it changes other things, but it's unchanging in itself. It never changes any state. It never goes from being A to B to C. Nothing like that. It's just permanent. And that, says Aquinas, is what we call God. The source of change. The unchanging source of change. That's one way Aquinas says we can talk about the existence of God, is as the unchanging source of change. That's the first of the 5 ways. If you want it in a straight-up syllogism, you might think premise 1, whatever is undergoing change is being changed by something else. Premise 2, this sequence cannot go on forever. Therefore, there must be an unchanging source of change. And this, says Aquinas, we can call God. That's the first way. The second way is similar, but it deals with something called efficient causation. Why is there causation in the universe? Right? This board is on the wall right now. It's just staying there. What's causing the board to stay on the wall? Oh, the glue the gravity, the walls being mounted in the ground a certain way. Well, what's responsible for the wall being grounded a certain way? Well, the Earth's ground, the way the Earth holds together due to gravity and due to its relationship to the sun. Well, why does the Earth have that relationship to the sun? Well, because of the sun's massive density, which causes gravitational fields and warped space. Okay, this is efficient cause. Well, just like Aquinas thinks we can ask why change, Aquinas thinks we can ask why cause, why efficient. It's a special kind of cause. It's called efficient cause. And so Aquinas says the answer must be an uncaused source of causation. And that, he says, we can call God. The third way, Aquinas says that we can see that there are things that are contingent. Contingency is a feature of the universe. What's contingency? It's the opposite of necessity. It's a contingent fact that I'm sitting in this chair and not some other chair. It's a contingent fact that I'm alive. There's nothing about humanity that there had to be a Kovac. Well, Aquinas then sets out an argument to show why contingency. The answer must be something entirely non-contingent, something absolutely necessary, which he says we can call God. The fourth way is from gradation. The universe seems to have gradations of goodness. Some things are just better than others. Aquinas thinks that can also be thought to pose a question about the features of the universe. What is the source of the gradations of goodness? Aquinas thinks there must be something which is just absolute goodness, which he calls God. And the fifth way is the argument from order. Things happen in orderly, relatively predictable ways. Cats take care of their young, for example. Things act in regular, orderly ways conducive to our way of life, by the way, ways that make it possible for us to flourish on this planet. Well, what makes that regularity possible when it's non-conscious things acting so regularly? This is not quite an intelligent design argument, but it does have whiffs of that. Well, Aquinas says there must be a source of order for the universe. Okay, that's the 5 ways. Let's just focus on the first way, right? Why change? What is the source of change? Aquinas argues it must be unchangeable. God is the unmoved, unchangeable source of change. Well, is that the end of the story for Aquinas? No, that's like page 12 of this huge, massive work called the Summa Theologiae. Aquinas, as soon as he finishes the 5 ways, Aquinas says this: since we cannot know what God is, remember I keep saying that, since we cannot know what God is, only that there is God, we must now explore not the ways God exists, we now must explore how God doesn't exist. So when Aquinas turns to God's nature, to what we can truly say about God, things that can be literally affirmed of God, Aquinas emphasizes that we're going to be talking about what God isn't, what God is not. We've already said God's unchanging, unchangeable. God's the unchanging source of change. The 2 biggest aspects, it seems to me, of Aquinas' negative theology at this point, of emphasizing when discussing God's nature what God isn't. The 2 biggest ideas are Aquinas' ideas of divine simplicity and divine eternity. Divine simplicity. Everything in God is God. Whatever you can say of God, you can just say God is that. If God loves, then God is love, for example. Aquinas hasn't, by the way, yet argued that God loves, but if he can, and he will, if he can argue that God loves, he can argue God is love. You see, if God is the reason that we have a universe of spatio-temporal things, if God is the reason that there's any universe at all, anything, any of the things that exist in space and time, then Aquinas realizes God cannot be something spatio-temporal. God cannot be an item among the items in the universe. God cannot be a being among beings, on Aquinas' view. This is divine simplicity, that there is no genus that God belongs to. There is no group that you can put God in. And certainly, there's no category that includes both God and, say, you and me. No, not for Aquinas. For Aquinas, since God is the reason there's anything at all, since God is what makes the difference between existence and nothingness, God is wholly unlike anything. God is entirely different from anything that you and I have access to intellectually or perceptually. Divine simplicity, on Aquinas' view, tells us that what is God? God is divinity. Well, what's divinity? It's what God is. End of story. There's nothing else there. It's just divinity through and through. As to where you, and if you talk about me for a moment, you can find all kinds of different, distinct things in me. You can find distinct physical parts. I've got this finger and this finger. They're different. Well, God has no material parts, so there's nothing like that. You can also find in me different ideas. I have some ideas about economics, and I have desires. I have a rage and love for some good, hot, spicy curry, good lamb vindaloo. Well, are my ideas about economics the same as my love for a lamb vindaloo? No, obviously not. In me, there are different, distinct things. In God, no. No distinctions, no differences like that. Whatever is in God just is God, on Aquinas' view. Whatever God does, whatever God is, that's just divinity. If God has ideas, God doesn't have different and distinct ideas. And since God's not part of the universe, not part of space and time, Aquinas also talks about divine eternity. There's no befores and afters in God. Aquinas will talk about the life of God, but Aquinas says God's life is complete, interminable, that means it has no beginning, no end, and is had completely and simultaneously all at once. That's what Aquinas says divine eternity is. Complete, simultaneous possession of interminable life. So it's not just having no beginning and no end, divine eternity. Aquinas thinks the universe, the world itself, might be something with no beginning and no end. God's eternity isn't just forever and ever and ever and ever. God's eternity, on Aquinas' view, involves no sequence of events, right? No befores and afters. It's not like, yesterday God created the world, then a little later God talked to Moses, then a little later God decided to become incarnate in the person of Christ, and someday God might even get around to ending it all and bringing about the final judgment. No, for Aquinas, right, God produces the universe here and now without being part of space and time, without having a life that goes in a sequence of events like that. God's life is complete, has no beginning, no end, and God has it all simultaneously, all at once. Now, you and I, of course, we can't picture life like that. Aquinas is not trying to help us picture God, right? No, this is negative theology. This is apophaticism. This is what God is not. Aquinas is, more than anything, trying to show us how utterly mysterious God is. Aquinas is trying to show us how any idea you have, you had better not think that it's God, right? You should stop applying all these ideas that you get from your earthly experiences and stop trying to slap them onto the divine nature. The divine nature is utterly unlike anything that you've ever thought about or could think about. If I tell you X loves Y, if I tell you X loves Y, and I ask you to start describing the love, tell me more about it, you're not going to get very far unless you know what X and Y are. Now, if I tell you spouse A loves spouse B, okay, a husband and a wife, for example, well, now you might start describing what you think that love looks like, because you know the nature of what we're talking about. You know a little bit about spouses. Or if I tell you a parent loves a child, okay, well, now again, you might start filling in the picture because you know what a parent is, you know what a child is, you know what that love will look like. If I tell you a child loves its pet goldfish, again, you can probably fill in the picture because you know what a pet is, you know what a child is. Well, what am I getting at? I'm getting at that if you want to understand how a predicate like loves works in some statement, you have to know something about the subject, whether it's a spouse, a parent, a child, a person on the street, whatever. To really grasp the predicate, you have to understand the subject, parent, child, whatever, spouse. Well, if you don't understand the subject, if you don't understand God, well, then of course you're not going to be able to fill in the picture. Anything you say about God will remain completely mysterious. So, divine eternity, this complete possession of simultaneous interminable life, Aquinas is not trying to help you understand what it's like to be God. Rather, Aquinas is trying to steer you away from idolatry. He's trying to steer you away from painting a picture of God that looks like you or me or any of the idols we might be tempted to worship. God is utterly unfathomable, completely ineffable. Okay, well, I hope you've enjoyed this little tasting sampler, this little appetizer of Aquinas' thought. You can take classes all about Aquinas here at Loyola Marymount University. You can take Faith and Reason with me. There's other professors of medieval philosophy and theology who teach Aquinas here. So if you want to get more details, see you down the road. Bye-bye now.